December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest of Belgium lay shrouded in morning mist, its ancient trees standing sentinel over frozen earth that would soon bear witness to one of the most desperate gambles in military history. The air hung heavy with the metallic scent of snow and diesel exhaust as German Panzer crews huddled around their steel giants, breath visible in crystalline puffs against the bitter cold. Obergefreiter Hans Müller pressed his gloved hands against the warm hull of his Panzer IV, feeling the rhythmic vibration of its Maybach engine as it idled in the pre-dawn darkness. In his fuel gauge, the needle hovered dangerously close to empty, a sight that had become all too familiar in these final months of the war. Operation Wacht am Rhein. Hitler's audacious counteroffensive through the Ardennes had begun with thunderous artillery barrages and the grinding advance of 3 German armies. For the Wehrmacht's armored divisions, this represented perhaps their final opportunity to split the Allied forces and reach the vital port of Antwerp. Yet as Müller and his comrades prepared for what their commanders promised would be a decisive victory, they carried with them a burden that had plagued German forces since the crushing defeats of 1943, chronic fuel shortages that reduced their mighty war machines to iron, coffins when their tanks ran dry, the German war economy, strangled by Allied bombing campaigns and the loss of Romanian oil fields, had been operating on fumes for months. Panzer divisions that once ranged freely across the steppes of Russia now calculated every kilometer with mathematical precision. Tank commanders carried slide rules to compute fuel consumption rates, and entire offensive operations were planned around the assumption that German forces would capture American fuel depots intact. The irony was not lost on veteran crews who remembered the early days of Barbarossa, when fuel seemed as infinite as their confidence in ultimate victory. As the morning fog lifted on that December day, revealing the vast American supply network sprawling across the Belgian countryside, German tankers would confront a reality that defied their most optimistic calculations. Across no man's land, American armored divisions sat poised with fuel trucks lined up in endless processions, their contents representing an industrial capacity that had transformed the nature of modern warfare itself. The contrast between German desperation and American abundance would prove more shocking than any weapon, more demoralizing than any defeat. The roots of this disparity stretched back to the fundamental philosophies that governed each nation's approach to mechanized warfare. German military doctrine, forged in the crucible of World War I's material shortages, emphasized efficiency, conservation, and the surgical application of force. Every drop of gasoline was precious, every movement calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimal resources. German tank crews were trained to view fuel as a finite resource to be husbanded like ammunition, parceled out in careful doses to sustain operations over extended periods. American military doctrine, by contrast, emerged from a nation blessed with seemingly inexhaustible natural resources and an industrial base that dwarfed all competitors. The United States produced more oil in a single year than Germany could hope to secure in a decade of conquest. American tank crews were trained not to conserve fuel, but to use it lavishly in pursuit of tactical objectives. Speed, maneuverability, and sustained operations became the hallmarks of American armored doctrine, precisely because fuel shortages were virtually unknown to forces equipped by Detroit's assembly lines. The statistical reality behind this contrast staggered even those who understood America's industrial might. In 1944 alone, the United States produced over 4.7 billion barrels of crude oil, while Germany's total petroleum reserves, including synthetic fuels and captured stocks, amounted to less than 50 million barrels. American forces in Europe consumed more fuel in a single month than the entire German war machine could produce in half a year. Every American tank division carried sufficient fuel for weeks of continuous operations, while their German counterparts measured their endurance in days or hours. Yet numbers alone could not convey the psychological impact of this disparity on German tank crews who had spent years adapting to scarcity. Veterans of the Eastern Front had learned to siphon fuel from disabled vehicles, to dilute gasoline with captured aviation fuel, and to abandon perfectly functional tanks when their fuel ran out. They had witnessed entire panzer formations reduced to static artillery because no fuel existed to move them forward or backward. The sight of American fuel trucks rolling past their positions would represent more than logistical superiority. It would symbolize the fundamental impossibility of German victory in a war of attrition. Sergeant Robert Murphy of the 3rd Armored Division had no conception of his enemy's fuel crisis as he supervised the refueling of his Sherman tank on the morning of December 16th. The Massachusetts native watched with practiced efficiency as his crew topped off their fuel tanks, checked their spare jerry cans, and prepared for another day of what they assumed would be routine patrolling. Murphy's tank carried 660 gallons of gasoline in its main fuel system, with additional reserves stored in external cans, enough fuel to travel over 200 miles at cruising speed. More importantly, he knew that fuel trucks would arrive within hours to replenish any consumption, part of a supply chain that stretched unbroken back to Texas refineries and Oklahoma oil fields. The American fuel supply system represented one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in military history. Every gallon of gasoline that powered Allied tanks in Belgium had traveled thousands of miles through a network of pipelines, tanker ships, railroad cars, and truck convoys. The construction of the Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines had eliminated bottlenecks in petroleum transport from southwestern oil fields to East Coast refineries. Liberty ships carried refined gasoline across submarine-infested waters to British ports, where it was transferred to smaller tankers for the Channel crossing. From Normandy beaches to forward supply depots, an endless stream of fuel trucks maintained the lifeline that kept Allied armor rolling toward Germany. This logistical miracle rested upon an industrial base that had undergone revolutionary expansion since Pearl Harbor. American oil production had increased by over 30% since 1941, driven by new drilling technologies and the discovery of vast reserves in Texas, Louisiana, and California. Refinery capacity had more than doubled through crash construction programs that turned raw crude into aviation gasoline, diesel fuel, and motor oil with unprecedented efficiency. The Allies possessed not merely adequate fuel supplies, but such overwhelming abundance that waste became operationally insignificant. German intelligence officers had documented American fuel consumption rates with growing alarm throughout 1943 and 1944. Captured supply manifests revealed that single American armored divisions consumed more fuel in a week than entire German army groups received in a month. Reconnaissance flights over Allied positions showed fuel depots that dwarfed Germany's strategic reserves. Perhaps most demoralizing were reports from German prisoners who had witnessed American forces burning fuel to clear landing zones, using gasoline to start campfires, and abandoning partially fueled vehicles rather than waiting for recovery operations. The symbolic power of fuel extended beyond its tactical significance to represent competing visions of modern warfare and national strength. For German tankers raised on stories of blitzkrieg victories achieved through speed and audacity, the reality of fuel rationing represented a profound betrayal of their military heritage. Panzer commanders who had once ranged hundreds of miles in single operations now found themselves tethered to supply lines that could barely sustain local movements. The psychological weight of this constraint proved as debilitating as any material shortage. American tankers, by contrast, absorbed lessons about the relationship between industrial capacity and military effectiveness that would shape post-war strategic thinking. The knowledge that their homeland could fuel unlimited operations created a confidence that transcended individual tactical situations. When faced with difficult terrain or determined resistance, American commanders could afford to use fuel-intensive flanking maneuvers, sustained bombardments, and continuous operations that wore down enemy resistance through sheer persistence rather than tactical brilliance. As Operation Wacht am Rhein unfolded across the snow-covered Ardennes, these competing fuel philosophies would clash with devastating clarity. German Panzer spearheads achieved initial tactical surprises, penetrating deep into American positions and capturing strategic crossroads. Yet their success carried the seeds of inevitable failure, as each mile advanced consumed irreplaceable fuel reserves while moving farther from already inadequate supply lines. German tank commanders found themselves forced to choose between tactical objectives and fuel conservation, knowing that every gallon spent in combat reduced their ability to exploit success or escape encirclement. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolphi. Hitler exemplified this tragic paradox during the early stages of the offensive. Commanded by SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Mohnke, the division's tank crews had been promised captured American fuel depots would sustain their advance to Antwerp. Initial success in overrunning American positions near Malmedy seemed to validate this optimistic assumption. German tankers whooped with joy as they discovered intact fuel trucks and supply dumps, viewing these captures as vindication of their strategic planning. Yet celebration turned to dismay as German mechanics examined the captured American equipment more closely. The fuel trucks contained not merely adequate supplies for immediate tactical needs, but quantities that seemed almost incomprehensible to soldiers accustomed to strict rationing. Individual American supply trucks carried more fuel than entire German companies had seen in weeks. Supply dumps contained thousands of gallons stored in neat rows of jerry cans, suggesting a logistical system that regarded fuel as a basic commodity rather than a precious resource. Unteroffizier Friedrich Weber, a veteran tank commander with the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, later recalled his amazement at discovering an American fuel depot near St. Vith that contained enough gasoline to sustain his entire regiment for months of operations. Weber had spent the previous year conducting tactical movements with fuel gauges that never rose above half full, planning routes to minimize consumption and often remaining stationary for days to conserve precious gasoline. The sight of American jerry cans stacked like cordwood, more fuel than he had ever seen in one location, challenged his fundamental assumptions about modern warfare's limitations. The psychological impact of this discovery extended beyond individual German soldiers to reshape their understanding of American military capabilities. Wehrmacht intelligence had long focused on counting American tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces while overlooking the industrial infrastructure that sustained these weapons in continuous operation. German military planning assumed that American forces, despite their numerical advantages, would face the same fuel constraints that had crippled German operations since 1943. The revelation that American fuel supplies were not merely adequate but virtually unlimited forced a complete reassessment of strategic possibilities. Reports from captured German officers revealed the profound demoralization that accompanied this realization. Major General Fritz Bayerlein of the Panzer Lehr Division, captured during the closing phases of the Ardennes offensive, told his interrogators that discovering American fuel abundance had been more shocking than witnessing superior American tank production. Bayerlein had commanded armored formations since the early days of the North African campaign, when Rommel's Africa Corps achieved remarkable victories despite chronic supply shortages. The Major General understood that tactical brilliance could overcome numerical disadvantages and that superior training could compensate for inferior equipment. No amount of tactical innovation, however, could solve the fundamental equation of mechanized warfare without adequate fuel supplies. American forces, meanwhile, operated within a logistical environment that German commanders could barely comprehend. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion exemplified this operational freedom during the relief of Bastogne. When German forces surrounded the strategic crossroads town, cutting off the 101st Airborne Division from conventional supply lines. Abrams received orders to break through enemy positions and establish contact with the besieged garrison. His response reflected an approach to armored warfare that fuel abundance made possible. Rather than conserving fuel for a single decisive thrust, Abrams launched continuous probing attacks that consumed enormous quantities of gasoline while wearing down German defensive positions. His tanks maintained round-the-clock operations, using fuel-intensive maneuvers to achieve tactical flexibility rather than husbanding resources for future operations. When German anti-tank guns forced his lead elements to withdraw, Abrams simply ordered flanking movements that consumed additional fuel but avoided costly frontal assaults. The knowledge that fuel trucks would arrive within hours to replenish any expenditure freed American commanders to use gasoline as a tactical weapon rather than treating it as a constraint. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity became most apparent in maintenance operations that revealed each side's different relationship with fuel resources. American armored units routinely warmed tank engines during cold weather to prevent mechanical problems, consuming significant quantities of fuel for purely preventive maintenance. German tank crews, by contrast, started their engines only when absolutely necessary, accepting increased mechanical failures rather than wasting precious gasoline on engine warming. American maintenance doctrine emphasized keeping all vehicles in running condition regardless of fuel costs, while German procedures prioritized fuel conservation even at the expense of mechanical reliability. This philosophical difference extended to tactical employment of armored forces in ways that shaped battlefield outcomes. Beyond simple numerical comparisons, American tank units could afford to conduct reconnaissance in force, using fuel-intensive movements to gather intelligence about enemy positions. German commanders, constrained by fuel shortages, relied increasingly on static defensive positions that conserved gasoline but surrendered tactical initiative to more mobile American forces. The freedom to maneuver became itself a decisive advantage that transcended questions of individual weapon performance or crew training. Weather conditions during the Battle of the Bulge amplified these disparities in ways that German planners had failed to anticipate. The unusually harsh winter of 1944-45 increased fuel consumption for all mechanized forces as engines worked harder in sub-freezing temperatures and vehicles required longer warm-up periods. American forces absorbed these additional fuel requirements without significant operational modifications, their supply system possessing sufficient reserves to accommodate increased consumption rates. German forces, already operating at the margins of sustainability, found their effective range further reduced by weather conditions that turned every movement into a calculated risk. The sound of American fuel trucks became a recurring motif throughout the Ardennes campaign, representing not merely logistical superiority, but a fundamental difference in national approaches to mechanized warfare. German soldiers grew accustomed to the constant rumble of American supply convoys that moved with impunity behind Allied lines, their engines running continuously regardless of fuel costs. These convoys represented more than tactical resupply. They symbolized an industrial system that could afford to waste more fuel than Germany could produce. Captured German documents from the period revealed attempts to calculate American fuel consumption rates that bordered on the fantastic. Intelligence officers reported that single American armored divisions consumed more fuel in daily operations than the entire German Sixth Army had received during the Stalingrad campaign. These calculations seemed so implausible that some German commanders dismissed them as enemy disinformation designed to undermine morale. The reality proved even more overwhelming than the most pessimistic German estimates. American fuel supply operations during the Ardennes offensive demonstrated organizational capabilities that extended far beyond simple resource abundance. When German breakthrough forces threatened Allied supply lines, American logistics officers rerouted fuel convoys through alternative routes without significant operational delays. Fuel depots moved forward with advancing American forces, maintaining supply ratios that German commanders found incomprehensible. The flexibility of American supply operations reflected not merely material advantages but systematic approaches to logistics that treated fuel as a renewable resource rather than a finite constraint. The transformation of German strategic thinking became evident in captured planning documents from the final weeks of the Ardennes offensive. Wehrmacht staff officers began calculating operational objectives based not on tactical possibilities but on available fuel supplies, a fundamental reversal of traditional German military planning. Panzer divisions that had once been deployed to achieve decisive strategic outcomes were now positioned to minimize fuel consumption, their tactical employment constrained by logistical limitations rather than enemy resistance. By early January 1945, as German forces began their inevitable withdrawal from advanced positions in the Ardennes, the fuel disparity had become apparent to soldiers on both sides. American tank crews observed abandoned German vehicles that appeared mechanically sound but had simply run out of gasoline, their crews forced to destroy functional equipment rather than allow its capture. The sight of intact German tanks rendered immobile by fuel shortages provided vivid illustration of strategic realities that transcended tactical considerations. The psychological impact on German tank crews proved as decisive as any material shortages. Veterans who had served since the early victories in Poland and France could remember when fuel seemed unlimited and tactical objectives determined operational planning. The gradual transformation from fuel abundance to scarcity had paralleled Germany's declining strategic position, making every empty fuel gauge a reminder of national limitations that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. The knowledge that their American opponents operated without similar constraints created a demoralization that extended beyond immediate tactical situations. Lieutenant Hans Joachim Marseille of the 2nd Panzer Division, later captured near Houffalize, described to his interrogators the moment when he truly understood America's fuel superiority. Marseille had been observing American tank movements through his periscope when he noticed enemy vehicles running their engines continuously during tactical pauses, consuming fuel for no apparent tactical purpose. The casual waste of gasoline that represented precious hours of operational capability for German forces revealed an abundance that made conventional conservation measures irrelevant. The symbolic power of fuel extended beyond immediate tactical implications to represent competing visions of national strength and industrial capability. German propaganda had long emphasized efficiency, conservation, and the disciplined use of limited resources as virtues that would ultimately triumph over American material excess. The reality of combat operations revealed these virtues to be necessities, born of weakness rather than strategic, advantages that could compensate for industrial limitations. American operations research teams, studying fuel consumption patterns during the Ardennes campaign, documented usage rates that would have seemed impossible to pre-war military planners. Armored divisions averaged over 100,000 gallons of gasoline per day during active operations, quantities that exceeded the total fuel allocation for entire German army groups. These consumption rates reflected not waste, but operational doctrine that viewed fuel as a tool to achieve tactical objectives rather than a constraint that limited strategic possibilities. The contrast became most apparent in night operations, when German forces typically remained stationary to conserve fuel while American units continued around-the-clock operations. German tank commanders could hear the constant sound of American engines throughout the night, representing not merely tactical activity, but the fundamental advantage of unlimited fuel supplies. The ability to maintain continuous operations wore down German resistance through persistent pressure rather than dramatic tactical breakthroughs. As the Battle of the Bulge reached its climax in late December 1944, fuel considerations had become the determining factor in German tactical planning. Panzer commanders calculated movement routes based on fuel efficiency rather than tactical advantage, often accepting inferior positions rather than expending gasoline to reach more favorable terrain. The constraint of limited fuel supplies forced German forces into predictable movement patterns that American intelligence officers learned to exploit for tactical advantage. Weather conditions during the crucial period between December 20th and 25th created additional fuel burdens that American forces absorbed, without operational modification, while German units found their effective range further reduced. Sub-zero temperatures increased fuel consumption by as much as 40% as engines worked harder to maintain operating temperatures and vehicles required extended warm-up periods. American supply doctrine had anticipated these increased requirements, maintaining fuel reserves that could accommodate weather-related consumption increases. German forces, already operating at the margins of sustainability, found their tactical options further constrained by environmental factors beyond their control. The psychological transformation of German tank crews became evident in their tactical behavior as fuel shortages reached critical levels. Commanders who had once executed bold flanking maneuvers began conserving fuel for potential withdrawal operations, their tactical aggression tempered by awareness that empty fuel tanks meant certain capture or death. The knowledge that American opponents faced no similar constraints created a defensive mindset that abandoned traditional German tactical doctrine in favor of fuel conservation. The final collapse of German offensive operations in the Ardennes can be traced directly to fuel exhaustion rather than tactical defeat in any conventional sense. Panzer spearheads that had penetrated deep into American positions found themselves unable to exploit initial success due to empty fuel tanks rather than enemy resistance. The sight of abandoned German tanks, their crews forced to destroy functional equipment due to fuel shortages, provided American forces with tangible evidence of strategic advantages that transcended immediate tactical considerations. In the broader context of World War II's industrial competition, the fuel disparity observed during the Battle of the Bulge represented the ultimate triumph of American production capacity over German efficiency. The United States had transformed warfare from a contest of tactical skill and strategic innovation into a competition of industrial endurance that favored nations capable of sustaining unlimited material consumption. German military excellence, forged through centuries of tactical innovation and professional competence, proved inadequate when confronted with opponents who could afford to waste more resources than Germany could produce. The legacy of this fuel disparity extended far beyond the immediate tactical outcomes of the Ardennes offensive to reshape post-war strategic thinking about mechanized warfare. American military doctrine absorbed lessons about the relationship between industrial capacity and operational effectiveness that would influence strategic planning throughout the Cold War era. The knowledge that abundant fuel supplies could compensate for tactical limitations created confidence in material approaches to military problems that emphasized production capacity over tactical innovation. For German survivors of the Ardennes campaign, the memory of American fuel abundance remained a lasting symbol of national limitations that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. Veterans who had witnessed the casual waste of gasoline by American forces carried with them an understanding of industrial disparities that challenged fundamental assumptions about military effectiveness. The sight of endless American fuel trucks rolling past German positions had represented more than logistical superiority. It symbolized the triumph of democratic industrial capacity over authoritarian efficiency. The jerrycan, that ubiquitous symbol of modern mechanized warfare, became during those frozen December days a measure of two nations' divergent destinies. For German tank crews, each container represented precious hours of operational capability to be husbanded like ammunition and parceled out with mathematical precision. For American forces, jerrycans lined supply depots in quantities that made individual containers almost meaningless. their contents flowing like water from an inexhaustible spring. In this simple metal container lay the seeds of victory and defeat, abundance and scarcity, democracy's industrial might, and tyranny's ultimate limitation. The lesson echoed across the snow-covered Ardennes long after the guns fell silent, that freedom's greatest weapon was not courage or tactical brilliance, but the simple abundance that allowed a democracy's soldiers to fill their tanks without counting the cost, to advance without calculating the fuel consumed, and to fight with the confidence that came from knowing their homeland's wells would never run dry.